know that they're not.
No, but I mean, why, for instance, say that it has THC in it, and should any vape, any counterfeit vape that has THC or says that it has, be under suspicion?
I think any illicit substance that's purchased should be under suspicion. People don't know what it is that they're buying, and ideally they should be able to have access to be able to test these substances, so they understand the risks that they're exposing themselves to.
Right, but they won't have, will they? I mean, they won't have access to be able to test it. What do we do?
There are a couple of facilities. There's a drug checking facility called Wedinos, where people can post in samples of substances that they have and declare what their purchase intent was, and this programme will then test what was actually detected in the sample, and that's where these THC vapes have been detected, and there have recently been drug checking facilities introduced in the city of Bristol as well.
Right. How big a problem is this? I mean, are we talking about a serious risk to many lives because of it?
That's very difficult to put a number on, because at the moment the testing is done voluntarily by members of the public. So we can see that this is a potential trend that people need to be aware of might be a wider problem. Cannabis is the most widely used illicit substance in the UK and globally, and there's a large pool of users that could be at risk from the harms of counterfeit vapes that contain this xylazine drug.
Dr. Caroline Copeland, thank you.
It's 7 minutes to 7. Almost a third of the inmates released from Peterborough prison in the last year have become homeless. Just one bit of bad news contained in a report from the Prisons Inspectorate published today. The report also says a third of inmates told the Inspectorate that it was easy to access illicit substances in prison, whilst around 1 in 6 inmates said they developed a drug problem since being in prison. Tom Wheatley is president of the Prison Governors Association. Good morning, Mr. Wheatley.
Good morning.
Does this surprise you at all?
Unfortunately, it's not a surprise. Peterborough was inspected in 2018 by the Chief Inspector, and at that point the Chief Inspector's assessment was it was, you know, a good prison of its type. In the intervening 6 years, a number of things have happened across the prison service in England and Wales, with sort of changes to staff, high turnover of staff, and when they've come back in 2024, they found, unfortunately, a different picture.
Part of that picture is 1/3 of officers being routinely unavailable for duty and morale being described as low. Does that have echoes across the prisons estate?
Yes, I think it does, unfortunately. Morale is obviously affected by working conditions. Many staff have worked through the pandemic. A pandemic fundamentally changed things in prison. So, you know, for 2 years, prisons ran very, very limited regimes, and the employment market at various points during that period of time was buoyant. So staff had gone to other work, and new staff coming in experienced a very different sort of prison to the one that they could expect when the prison opened up and prisoners returned to work. So we had a period of time where prisons have really struggled to bring their regimes back and to get prisoners out to work.
How on earth do governors make a prison work when 1/3 of officers are routinely unavailable for duty?
That's very, very difficult. So they have to prioritise things. In Peterborough's case, it appears they've prioritised safety, so they've done all they can to maintain the safety of prisoners. But that's been at the expense of a predictable regime. So when prisoners have long periods of inactivity, the use of illicit drugs obviously becomes more attractive to them, because otherwise they're locked in a cell with nothing to do. And that's one of the things that can drive this kind of change. It's very difficult to run anywhere effectively when you can't recruit and retain a suitable number of suitably trained staff.
Briefly on this point about drugs, I mean, anyone who's watched a prison drama will be unsurprised about it, but still, I mean, a third of inmates saying it's easy to access illicit substance, 1 in 6 saying they've developed a drug problem whilst in prison.
Yeah, I mean, from the Chief Inspector's assessment, they've identified that there's been some weaknesses specifically at Peterborough in terms of their drug strategy, in that the strategy was old, it needed refreshing, it hadn't had the kind of attention they would expect.
Right.
So, this is a particular problem at Peterborough. But if you look at a similar group of prisons to Peterborough, from HMIP's data, which is the surveys that they undertake with prisons when they come to do an inspection, for the rest of Peterborough's comparative group, it's around 28% would say the same thing. So it's not a huge disparity from the norm.
Tom Wheatley will leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Tom Wheatley, President of the Prison Governors Association.
3 minutes to 7 to the weather and Simon.
Justin, we had a brief, quieter spell overnight. A ridge of high pressure built in across the UK, giving some clear skies and temperatures down close to fairly low single figures, actually. So a bit of a frost in 1 or 2 locations. But that quieter weather isn't going to last because there is more rain waiting out towards the west, which is going to spread in across all areas. But for southeast, eastern and northeast England, it's a chilly start with some clear skies, so there will be some sunshine. The cloud, though, thickening up throughout the morning and rain eventually spreading into the afternoon. It's going to give quite a bit of rain towards northeast and eastern parts of England, but in the southeast, perhaps just giving an hour or so of some wet weather as it clears eastward, and maximum temperatures getting up to about 11 to 14 degrees. In southwest England, Wales, the Midlands, Wales and northwest England, it's again a chilly start, but it's already cloudy with some rain in western areas. That's going to spread eastward. It'll turn really quite heavy across parts of northwest England into around about lunchtime. The rain is going to clear eastward, but it'll stay cloudy into the afternoon with some drizzle, some hill fog around coastals and hilly areas, and maximum temperatures 13 to 15 Celsius. For Northern Ireland, it's a wet start, but that rain is going to clear away. It's going to be drier, but cloudy for much of the afternoon, and then another area of rain spreads in by this evening, highs of 13 or 14 degrees. And across Scotland, a dry and a clear start in eastern areas, rain in the west, though, spreading to all parts. A very wet afternoon, especially in the west, and highs of 10 to 13.
Thanks, Simon. This weekend, the history of a small disc which had a big impact.
On BBC Radio 4.
You took the record out the sleeve, you put it on your record player, you picked up the arm and you put the stylus in the groove and this magical sound came out.
To mark its 75th anniversary, Pete Waterman celebrates the 7-inch single.
You could take it home with you, you could smell it, you could look at it, you could read the writing on it. Buying a 7-inch single, it was yours. It was just absolutely mind-blowing.
7 Inches of Joy, the single at 75. This Saturday night at 8 on Radio 4 and BBC Sounds.
In the next hour on this programme, we will be hearing from Dr. Hilary Cass on the morning that her report into gender services in the NHS in England is published. We'll also be asking, as Billie Eilish promises her new album will have an eco-friendly release, whether that could be the new rock and roll.
You are listening to Today on BBC Radio 4 with Justin Webb and Johnny Diamond. It's 7 o'clock on Wednesday, the 10th of April. The headlines: a review carried out for the NHS says children questioning their gender have been let down by a lack of research and by the toxic debate around the issue. President Biden has expressed more frustration with Israel, urging it to just call a ceasefire in Gaza. Assaulting a shop worker is to be made a specific offence in England and Wales, punishable by up to 6 months in prison. The BBC News is read by Lisa Costello.
A major review of gender services in England says children and young people have been let down by a lack of research and remarkably weak evidence on medical interventions. The report's author, the paediatrician Dr. Hilary Cass, said standards for gender care should match those found throughout the NHS. She also said the toxicity of the debate around gender issues meant professionals were afraid to openly discuss their views. Our health editor Hugh Pym reports.
The independent review was set up after a sharp rise in referrals to the gender service at the Tavistock and Portman Trust in London. In her interim report, Dr. Cass said there was not enough evidence that drugs which stopped the onset of puberty were safe or effective. Last month, NHS England said they would no longer be routinely prescribed, and the service at the Trust was closed, with 2 new centres set up in London and Liverpool. In her final report, Dr. Cass has said that the lack of evidence on the long-term impact of taking hormones from an early age had let children down. She says there should be an expansion of services and recommends individual care plans and mental health support. The report calls for a separate way into the system for younger children and their families, with an early meeting with a clinical professional. There should also be a follow-through service for 17 to 25-year-olds rather than moving straight into adult services. NHS England said a full implementation plan would be set out and there would be a review of adult gender services.
Dr. Cass has warned that polarisation of views and the stifling of debate about gender issues have done nothing to help young people who are, in her words, caught in the middle of a stormy social discourse. She told this programme that doctors were referring patients to the Gender Identity Development Service, or GIDS, for fear of causing upset.
Because of the toxicity of the debate, they've often been bypassed by local services who've been really nervous about seeing them. So rather than doing the things that they would do for other young people with depression or anxiety or perhaps undiagnosed autistic spectrum disorder, they've tended to pass them straight on to the GID service, and they then ended up at the back of a very long waiting list because GIDS wasn't really able to cope with the rising numbers.
And you can hear the full interview with Dr. Cass after 7:30. President Biden has called on Israel to agree to a 6 to 8 week ceasefire in Gaza to allow deliveries of food and medicine. The comment, in an interview that was recorded last week but broadcast last night, marks a departure from Mr. Biden's previous position that it was the responsibility of Hamas to agree to a truce. Our Middle East correspondent Hugo Beshega reports from Jerusalem.
In a significant shift in tone, President Biden said Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was making a mistake with the way he was conducting the war. I don't agree with his approach, he said. And in a sign of intensifying pressure on Israel, he urged the country to just agree to a ceasefire deal with Hamas. The interview was recorded before the latest round of talks in Cairo, which have included the head of the CIA. The ceasefire proposal includes the release of 40 hostages being held in Gaza in return for 900 Palestinians from Israeli jails. Hamas said it was analyzing the offer. Mr. Biden also called for unlimited food and medicine to enter Gaza, saying there was no excuse for aid not to be given to people there.
Arizona has become the 15th US state to impose a near-total ban on abortion since the nationwide right to a termination was removed 2 years ago. A ruling by Arizona's Supreme Court revives a law from 1864, although it won't be enforced immediately. The decision has caused anger there, with the Democrat governor calling it an affront to freedom. The White House said abortion rights across the country were mired in chaos and confusion. Reporting from Washington, Carl Nasman.
The law is one of the strictest abortion bans in the U.S. and also one of the oldest, dating back 160 years to the Civil War, when Arizona is a prison sentence of 2 to 5 years for performing an abortion, except when the mother's life is at risk. Lawyers for the conservative Christian group that brought the case said the ruling would allow the state to fully protect life again. President Biden called it cruel, and his vice president, Kamala Harris, has said that she will visit the state next week to discuss abortion rights. In a sign of the political potency of the issue, many Arizona Republicans have also come out against the decision. Voters, though, could have the final say. A state measure to protect abortion is likely to be on the ballot in November in this battleground state that could also help decide the presidential election.
Rescuers in northern Italy are searching for 4 people after an underground explosion at a hydroelectric plant. 3 people died in the blast at Lake Suviana, just over 40 miles south of Bologna. At least 5 others were injured. The energy company which runs the plant said a fire had broken out before the explosion. It has yet to establish the cause. Assaulting a shop worker is to be made a separate criminal offence in England and Wales. The government had said there was no need for such a measure, but it's now changed its mind. Rishi Sunak says staff must be free to work without the threat of crime or abuse. Here's our Home Affairs correspondent, Tom Simons.
Growing numbers of shop workers are being attacked and injured. There was a spike in retail-related violence during the pandemic, and it remains high. The new law will introduce a specific offence of assaulting a retail worker with a maximum sentence of 5 months in prison, though offenders can still be charged with causing grievous bodily harm and face a longer sentence. The move, already Labour policy, is part of a series of measures to deal with retail crime, as businesses report growing levels of shoplifting. Dedicated facial recognition units will be used in high streets, and police have been told to check more CCTV images against their databases. They have previously been criticised for failing to respond to shoplifters. Today's plans include the increased use of electronic tags and criminal behaviour orders to tackle repeat offenders, with a 5-year prison sentence for breaching an order.
3 women and 2 men have admitted their roles in the biggest case of benefit fraud brought before the courts in England and Wales. They stole more than £50 million over 4.5 years by repeatedly submitting false claims for universal credit. All 5 are from Bulgaria and were based in North London. They'll be sentenced next month. Britain's most successful gymnast, Max Whitlock, who's won 6 Olympic medals, 3 of them gold, has told the BBC he'll retire after the Games in Paris this summer. He's aiming to become the first gymnast to win 4 consecutive medals on the same apparatus, in his case the pommel horse. Whitlock, who's 31, said the decision to retire was tricky, but he felt in his gut this was the right time.
Ever since, I suppose, Rio Olympics, where I was at my peak age, I've had questions thrown at me about, like, when am I retiring? When you get that constantly, for about 8 years, you do naturally think about it. I've wanted to prove people wrong a lot of my way through my journey, and I've always had the mindset of trying to do this for as long as I possibly can.
What scientists are calling a very rare and unusual find in Argentina suggests man's best friend may have once been a fox. The bones of a now extinct species were discovered alongside the remains of 21 people in a mass grave in Patagonia, dating back 1,500 years. Analysis at Oxford University shows the fox hadn't been eaten, and its diet was the same as the humans. The researchers say it probably lived alongside the hunter-gatherers, sharing a strong bond with them.
Thanks, Tina. It's 7:08. The man at the heart of the so-called honey trap saga at Westminster has resigned. The Conservative whip, William Wragg, MP for Hazelgrove, confessed or admitted to the Times newspaper last week that he had, because of concerns that compromising material on him might be published, he'd given the personal details of colleagues to people at confidence, at the very least. It's a very murky tale. Mr. Wragg has yet to speak publicly about it, apart from that statement to the Times newspaper. Sir Geoffrey Clifton-Brown is Conservative MP for the Cotswolds. He's been an MP since April 1992, so he has a little bit of perspective on this. Good morning, Sir Geoffrey.
Good morning, Johnny.
Do you think Mr. Wragg has done the right thing?
Absolutely. He's voluntarily resigned the whip. He, as soon as the procedures can be completed, will be resigning from his select committee, and he has resigned as vice chairman of the 22. So he effectively has paid the political price. I think his political career is over, and I would just like to simply say that at Westminster we all wish him well, and he is vulnerable, and we hope he now gets a period of quiet to be able to recover from this dreadful incident.
There have been some questions, some demands from the opposition, from the Labour Party, that the Conservative Party itself should have acted more quickly once Mr. Wragg had given his confession to the Times, when Pat McFadden described as an indictment of Rishi Sunak's weakness. Do you think the party should have moved on this?
Well, I think that anybody is entitled to a proper process. This broke, I think, on Thursday. It was settled yesterday, Thursday to Tuesday. I think both William Wragg and the party dealt with it in an expeditious way, and I think the right outcome has now been had, and I think any criticism of Rishi Sunak is entirely misplaced.
The whole affair comes at a time of heightened sensitivity around parliamentarians and the data they have, the kind of information and research that's available to them. There is suggestion, at least, of pretty concerted attempts by hostile actors to gain access to Parliament and the information that MPs have. Do you get much advice from parliamentary authorities about data security and the like?
Well, John, this is, I think, a really interesting question. Of course, MPs are constantly in the public domain, and that means that all aspects of their private lives are also constantly under scrutiny. And this whole issue of keeping data safe is both paramount importance. We have very sensitive data on a large number of people, our constituents, and so on. It's paramount that we keep that data safe, but it's also paramount that we keep our own data safe. And I do think that as a result of this, the government agencies, parliamentary authorities, and members of parliament will need to review how they do all that. And I do think that more training and more advice is needed for members of parliament so that we can try and avoid this sort of thing, if possible, happening in the future.
Mr. Wragg has struggled